Well, it's that time in the morning when we take a look at what is making the news on the front pages of the international newspapers. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by the social commentator, the resplendent Claudine Reid.
Good morning,
We're matching,
Julia.
we're like twins.
We are indeed.
Let's start first with the Nigerian newspaper This Day, really picking up from a story that has really been dominating the news for some time now, for at least the last 2 weeks or so. Rescued women tell tales of hunger and lack. The headline slightly incomplete, but it is still quite harrowing nonetheless.
Yes, it is, and I mean, again, we're back to this same sort of story and looking at the aftermath of what's happened. We've had the Chibok girls, we've had other stories where other women and children have been kidnapped, but now we're looking at really putting in some sort of system or measurement in place to kind of deal with the situation.
And these were women and children who've been abducted by Boko Haram.
Yes, so they've been abducted. There's stories of a 15-year-old Zara named as one of the 15 women hostages, and there's women there nursing young children and just giving their harrowing account of the lack of support that they receive. So no water, no food, no sanitation that Boko Haram did not provide. And so now here we are, they've come back and trying to reintegrate back into some sort of normality.
And also healing the emotional scars as well.
Absolutely, of course.
OK, the other choice that you've made, that is the Wall Street Journal Asia. Taliban's softened stance on women's rights. Now, when I first saw this headline, I thought, hang on a minute, is there a mistake here? But it appears not when you actually get into the meat of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting here. You know, you look at the Taliban and everything that they stood for against women in terms of their male domination, especially in professions like engineering and politics and so on and so forth. But now they've decided to soften the stance and allow women to participate in politics, to choose their own husband. And I'm reading the headlines and thinking,
choose your own husband.
How lucky are we, kind of thing. But it's very interesting. I think what remains to be seen is whether or not they will really honour what they've been saying.
There's a quote here, in fact. My worry is that the Taliban have a very different understanding of women's right to education and political participation, and that it is based on their view that women are inherently inferior to men. The words of a Kabul-based activist. Moving on now to the China Daily. 4 named in campaign to halt bad behaviour. Now, who is misbehaving themselves?
Do you know, this is really quite interesting in terms of when you think about China and everything that they stand for, and looking at, you know, the dominance, I guess, of the government that's out there, and looking at how they manage with such an iron fist. And now you've got 4 people. It's almost like that name and shame.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes.
Absolutely, that name and shame scenario. So they've been named by the tourism industry as having, you know, bad behaviour, and now there's a chance that they may be blacklisted for 10 years, which then probably means they're not going to be able to travel. We're unclear as to how the blacklist will exactly work, but they have been named as having bad behaviour during their trips, and now there's a potential that they're going to be blacklisted. Yeah,
and the offences are quite interesting because there's one passenger who was surnamed Wang, who claimed he had a bomb, and water was actually thrown by a tourist surnamed Zhang, according to the top tourism authority. So there you go, that's what happens. OK, let's motor on and head for the Wall Street Journal Europe. Now, the headline here, US spying programme is ruled illegal. Now, that's the story that we've been following here on the news, and it's quite an interesting one.
Yes, indeed. Well, it's always very interesting when we're looking at situations around to do with spying and what that actually means for us in the UK. We've got past scenarios or past issues where we've had, you know, the death of a spy, was he poisoned, and all that sort of issue going on there. So we'll look at what will happen here. I think, you know, when we look at the spying programme, and of course it's ruled as illegal, but then how do we gather intelligence and just make sure that we put measures in place to protect our intelligence.
Privacy as well. OK, and staying with the Wall Street Journal Europe, now it's tucked into the front page, the bottom of the front page, but the story itself, when you expand the headline, the Kremlin plans largest display of military might on Red Square in decades. And I suppose in many respects that the Kremlin still obviously needs to flex its muscles because it feels under the cosh because of sanctions from the United States and Europe over Ukraine. And also, the article, again, looking at the meat of it, it gets into the amount of money that the Russian government is spending on military hardware.
Yes, because it states here that they've spent around $650 billion, which is around 20 trillion rubles, in terms of looking at how they're going to present this forward. But again, we're looking at Mr. Putin and all that he represents in Russia, and how we're going to, again, deal with this outstanding issue, their economic crisis.
Sure, and I suppose it's a case of that, of really balancing your priorities as well, because on the one hand, he's talking about increasing the budgets, but the military spend, whilst the country itself is in recession, basically, feeling the pressure from Western sanctions. OK, let's move on to USA Today International, and the headline there, side of the page, Baltimore asks Fed to probe its police force, which you could say was predictable given the controversy surrounding the conduct of this police force and in the wider context of black men dying at the hands of police officers. Yeah,
I mean, it's tragic that we're still having these discussions in this day and age, and just having a look at some of the other historical cases around police violence, you know, challenging black men in society. But you know, the mayor has sworn to take action, decisive action, and looking at how they can bring justice to the men, to their families, most importantly, and making sure that we bring some rest to the situation in Baltimore.
Yeah, and the article goes on to say that this particular investigation will be similar to a recent inquiry in Ferguson. It would examine all aspects of policing in the city to determine if bias exists in the department's arrest data, traffic stops and other operations. Yeah. Now let's turn now to The Guardian. This is the British newspaper. Now, you've got there, really speaking for itself, poll shocker for Labour. What they were responding to was an exit poll which would have been taken after people cast their votes. So that way they would have had a more accurate picture about the voting trends, how things were going, and ultimately who was going to get the keys to number 10. And it has been a rather disappointing 24 hours, crushing 24 hours, not just for Ed Miliband, the Labour opponent, but also for David Cameron's former coalition partner, Nick Clegg.
Yeah, I mean, the article speaks here about David Cameron, our current Prime Minister, securing an astonishing triumph, but at the same time, we look at some of the other parties, like you said, Nick Clegg, and some of the other key seats losing their majority hold. And so I think when we look at the run-up to the election and hearing all the discussion that has gone on and how optimistic, you know, some of the MPs were, and now it's come to D-Day and things haven't gone quite according to plan. So.
And it really picks up on a point that John Cookson made when I was speaking to him earlier, because he said, look, you had all these polls saying, yes, we're going to have a hung parliament. And he said, well, it's complete nonsense, because at the end of the day, you can't rule out how the voter feels when he or she goes into that polling station and they're confronted with the choices. They've worked it out. You cannot read their minds. You don't know what people are going to be thinking on the day.
Absolutely, and I think when you look at the exit polls, you still don't know how truthful it is anyway. They can walk out of there and say absolutely anything.
Yes, well, there you go, hiding their true intentions. But Claudine Reid, thank you so much for taking us through the analysis of the day's newspapers. We did very, very well.